Dust and smoke cover the fields near a small Soviet town called Kursk. German Tiger tanks creep forward, their gunners searching for targets, until their sights fill with fast-moving T-34s charging straight at them. In 1941, these same German tanks crushed everything in their path. In 1943, at Kursk, they would move only a few miles and never launch a major offensive in the east again. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, and the moment many historians see as the day Germany truly lost the East. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler gambled everything on one last massive attack, Operation Citadel, to cut off a huge Soviet bulge in the front line and smash the Red Army once more. Instead, he ran into miles of minefields, trenches, and anti-tank guns, prepared for months by Soviet commanders who knew exactly what was coming. In this video, the path will be followed from the German plan and delays, through the desperate fighting in the north and south, to the chaotic tank clash at Prokhorovka, and then the Soviet counterattack that turned the tide for good. This is Kursk, the day Germany lost the East. In early 1943, the Eastern Front had completely changed. Just months before, German armies had been deep inside the Soviet Union, pushing towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Now, after the brutal Soviet encirclement and the surrender of the German Sixth Army, the Wehrmacht was bleeding, exhausted, and in retreat. Stalingrad did not just cost Germany an army, it shattered the myth that German forces could not be beaten in a major battle. The Soviets sensed this shift. Their victory at Stalingrad boosted Red Army morale and gave their commanders confidence to plan larger offensives. Soviet forces pushed west, forcing German units to abandon exposed positions like the Rzhev salient and shorten their lines just to survive. For the first time, the question in Berlin was not how far can we advance, but how can we stop them. Yet, despite the disaster, Adolf Hitler refused to accept a defensive war. He believed that one decisive blow could still turn the tide back in Germany's favor. His generals searched the map for a place to strike and found a giant Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk. The plan was simple and bold. Attack this Kursk salient from north and south, cut it off in a pincer movement, and destroy the Soviet armies inside. This operation would be called Citadel, and it would lead directly to the Battle of Kursk. While German commanders argued over when to launch Operation Citadel, the Soviets were turning the Kursk salient into one of the most heavily fortified areas of the entire war. Soviet intelligence, supported by intercepted communications and foreign reports, warned Moscow months in advance that a major German attack would fall on this bulge in the front. There would be no surprise at Kursk. Instead of striking first, the Red Army chose to let the Germans come to them. Around Kursk, Soviet engineers and hundreds of thousands of civilians built a defense in depth, layer after layer of positions designed to slow, bleed, and finally stop the Panzer spearheads. In each sector, the Central and Voronezh fronts created multiple defensive belts, each one divided into zones of trenches, strongpoints, and gun emplacements stretching dozens of kilometers. These belts were not just lines on a map, they were packed with obstacles meant to break German momentum. Minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and log or concrete bunkers were laid out in front of and between Soviet positions. In the main defensive zones alone, Soviet troops laid hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, reaching densities of well over 1,000 mines per kilometer on the most threatened axes of attack. Any German advance would have to crawl forward under constant artillery and anti-tank fire. Behind the infantry and anti-tank. Despite the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler still believed a single decisive blow could restore German dominance in the East.
His high command designed Operation Citadel, a massive offensive aimed squarely at the Kursk salient, a huge bulge in the Soviet line that pushed up to 160 kilometers from north to south and about 90 to 160 kilometers deep. The idea was simple on paper: attack the bulge from the north and south at the same time, close the jaws around Kursk, and destroy the Soviet armies inside. Army Group Center would lend General Walter Model's 9th Army to strike down from the north, while Army Group South would attack from the south with General Hoff's powerful 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf. These were some of the best equipped and most experienced German forces left on the Eastern Front. German planners hoped that a successful encirclement would not only eliminate a major Soviet force, but also straighten their front line, freeing up reserves and buying time. However, the plan immediately ran into problems. Hitler wanted to wait for new miracle weapons like the Panther tank and the Ferdinand tank destroyer, believing their power fire and armor would smash through Soviet defenses. Production delays and doubts inside German headquarters led to the offensive being pushed back repeatedly, from an initial target in May all the way to early July. What was meant to be a swift spring strike turned into a summer attack that the Soviets could see coming from far away. Those delays were fatal. Every week the Germans waited, the Red Army mined more fields, dug more trenches, and brought in more guns, tanks, and reserves to the Kursk sector. Some German generals warned that the window for success was closing, but Hitler clung to the hope that his new heavy tanks could still force a breakthrough. By the time he finally gave the order to attack, Operation Citadel was no longer a surprise offensive. It was a scheduled collision with a fully prepared enemy. In the early hours of 5th July 1943, the quiet around Kursk was shattered. German artillery opened fire along the northern and southern faces of the salient, followed by waves of tanks and infantry moving forward into the darkness and early morning light. From the north, Model's 9th Army pushed toward the town of Kursk itself, while in the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Kempf's forces drove toward the key rail lines and villages guarding the city's approaches. But almost immediately, the offensive slowed. German spearheads ran into dense minefields and pre-registered Soviet artillery fire, losing tanks before they even reached the main defensive belts. Engineers had to clear paths under fire, while panzers bunched up on narrow lanes, turning them into easy targets. The Germans advanced, but not with the lightning speed of 1941. Every kilometer gained around Kursk came at a higher cost than they had ever seen before. In the north, General Walter Model's 9th Army ran straight into the heart of Rokossovsky's defenses. Over the next days, bitter fighting raged around villages like Ponyri and Olkovatka, names almost unknown in the West, but remembered by veterans as some of the hardest battles of the entire war. Ponyri Station, sitting on the vital railway between Orel and Kursk, became a key objective. Both sides understood that whoever held this small settlement would control the main route for supplies and reinforcements. The Germans threw infantry and armor against Ponyri again and again, capturing parts of the village only to be driven out by Soviet counterattacks. School buildings, tractor depots, water towers, and the railway station itself changed hands multiple times in brutal close-quarters combat. The struggle was so intense that soldiers on both sides began calling Ponyri a little Stalingrad. Despite heavy losses, Soviet defenders refused to break, and by around 10 July, the German advance in the north had effectively ground to a halt. Model's forces were exhausted, badly depleted, and still far from Kursk. With the northern pincers stalled, Hitler's hopes shifted increasingly to the south. If Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps could punch through the remaining Soviet lines and reach Prokhorovka, there was still a chance, however small, to cut into the Kursk salient from below. The decisive clash of armor was still to come. In the southern sector, German forces had advanced deeper than in the north, but at a terrible cost. By 8 to 10 July, the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps had fought its way through multiple defensive belts, capturing key positions like the Comsolet State Farm and high ground such as Hill 241.6. To their left, the Totenkopf Division forced a crossing over the Psel River and secured a bridgehead, setting the stage for a renewed push toward the town of Prokhorovka. The Soviets could not allow that to happen. Behind the front, the 5th Guards Tank Army was moving into position, ordered to halt the SS advance at all costs. As German units prepared a final drive to break the last Soviet lines on 12 July, massed Soviet tank formations were lining up for a counterattack of their own. Both sides were now concentrating hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns into a relatively small area. On the morning of 12 July 1943, southeast of Kursk, these forces would collide in one of the largest and most chaotic armored clashes in history, Prokhorovka. On the morning of 12 July 1943, near the small railway town of Prokhorovka, the southern offensive reached its breaking point. The elite 2 SS Panzer Corps, units like Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, stood poised on a narrow spearhead, preparing to push deeper toward Kursk. Facing them, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov received a simple, brutal order. Attack at once, smash the German spearhead, and stop any further advance, no matter the cost. Around 500 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns surged forward in waves, many of them T-34s and lighter T-70s, charging across open ground toward well-prepared German positions. Dust, smoke, and the rolling terrain forced the Soviets into extremely close-range combat, where long-range German guns on Tiger and Panther tanks lost some of their advantage. In some sectors, tanks fired at point-blank distance. There were reports of ramming, burning wrecks blocking routes, and vehicles colliding as visibility collapsed. The clash had the chaos of a medieval cavalry charge, except now the armor was steel. The price was terrible. Soviet tank corps suffered heavy losses, with some formations losing 30 to 60% of their armor in a single day and failing to completely destroy the German units in front of them. Yet, the Germans also bled, and crucially, did not break the Soviet line or regain the operational freedom they needed. By nightfall, both sides were exhausted, and the 2 SS Panzer Corps held only a shallow, vulnerable salient near Prokhorovka, instead of the deep breakthrough Hitler had demanded. While tanks were burning at Prokhorovka, the wider situation was turning against Germany. In the north, the Soviet Union launched Operation Kutuzov against the RL salient, striking the weakened German positions that had supported the northern pincer. At the same time, Soviet forces put increasing pressure on the southern wing of Army Group South, forcing the Germans to think about defense and withdrawal instead of further attacks. Under this growing pressure, and with news of the Allied landing in Sicily opening yet another front, Hitler decided to call off Operation Citadel. On 13 July, he met with his generals and ordered the offensive to be ended, pulling key units like the 2nd SS Panzer Corps out of the line within days. What had begun as Germany's last great gamble in the East ended as a failed offensive that cost them thousands of men and many of their best tanks and crews, losses the Reich could no longer afford to replace. The Soviets immediately seized the initiative. Their counteroffensives rolled on, pushing the Germans back from RL, Belgorod, and eventually Kharkov. From this point onward, the Red Army would remain on the offensive, driving west through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and finally into Berlin itself. Many historians see Kursk and the failure of Operation Citadel as the moment when Germany truly lost any hope of winning in the East. On those mind-smoking fields around Kursk and Prokhorovka, the era of German blitzkrieg ended, and the long, relentless Soviet advance to victory began. The Battle of Kursk ended without the dramatic encirclement Hitler had promised. Instead, it left his armies weakened, short of tanks and experienced crews, and forced onto the defensive along almost the entire Eastern Front. From August 1943 onward, the Red Army kept pressing forward with continuous offensives, pushing the Germans out of Orel and Kharkov, then across Ukraine and into Eastern Europe. Kursk was more than just the largest armored clash of the war. It marked the end of German blitzkrieg in the east and the beginning of Soviet dominance. Germany would never again launch a major offensive on this front. The initiative now belongs to the Soviet Union, whose growing industrial power and manpower would drive a series of hammer blows, culminating in operations like Bagration in 1944 and the final assault on Berlin in 1945. If the Battle of Kursk was the day Germany lost the East, the story of how the Red Army used that advantage to fight its way to Berlin is just beginning. In the next episode of this series, the focus will be on how Soviet offensives rolled west after Kursk, from the Dnieper to Belarus, and from the ruins of German hopes to the fall of the Reich itself. So, if this chapter of the war was found fascinating, stay tuned, subscribe to Battle History Files, and continue the journey from Kursk all the way to Berlin.